This is as close to a brand new, pristine, 60-year-old vacuum cleaner as one is likely to ever see. And this new addition comes to me from my good friend John, so thank you very much. This is a Hoover Dial-A-Matic, model 1110 from about 1965. It's the second model of this design. Hoover introduced the Dial-A-Matic clean air uprights, as they were called, in the early 60s as a radical departure from the traditional Hoover upright or the traditional upright vacuum anybody made, where the dirt went from the floor through the fan and up into the bag. And you could always tell the cloth or vinyl bag jacket that would puff up when the vacuum was on. I grew up with a Hoover convertible, and my first exposure to the Dial-A-Matics left me kind of underwhelmed. I felt that they were louder and more expensive and harder to work on and didn't do as good a job as the traditional convertibles. So what's the point? Well, the point was supposed to be instant, easy conversion to attachment use and much more effective attachment suction. So this two-stage motor doesn't move as much air, but it moves it much more forcefully, which makes it very well suited to putting a hose on. And that hose connection is right back here. And there's the dial. On the early Dilematic, it was this little kind of T-shaped knob, and it matched the upper cord hook very nicely. I always think that this is much more aesthetic than any of the later ones where the dial is a round knob. I also like that the early Hoover Dial-A-Matics did not have a height adjustment, not for function, just for aesthetics. I think this just gives it a very nice, clean look. And I love the color. They called this peacock blue. This is my favorite color of the Dilematic series. So I'm happy to have this, despite being all in all not a huge Dilematic fan. This one has sort of endeared me a little bit to them. And I mentioned that on the later ones, this dial, the suction dial, was a knob, a round knob, and it was easier then to keep it where it needed to be. Because really you'd want this over here just about all the time, but I, for one, like putting it in the middle when I wrap the cord back up, and then I have to remember to dial it back, otherwise half my suction is coming through here. This also used kind of an interesting or goofy or silly bag setup, in my opinion. So opening up, you can see the Hoover Style D bag, and it's a very common vacuum bag design nowadays to have a bag like this with a cardboard collar, but usually the cardboard collar is on the upper part of the bag, which gives you more dirt fill capacity. Well, on this, because the bag intake is right here, the dirt fill capacity is the lower third, and the top 2/3 of that bag really can't be, well, I would say can't be used, but I guess they are being used for airflow and filtration. And I also need to come across a pack of the old green Hoover bags. I don't like these at all. I think the genuine Hoover green bags were thicker and had a kind of a pleasant smell to them and did a better job. These are not great, but alas, there's D bags all over the world, but when you're actually looking for one, you can't find it. One of the things that made the early Dilematic less good cleaners than even the later Dilematic was the fact that the agitator helix on these, if the agitator is spinning this way, as it would be, it's actually corkscrewing the dirt away from the intake. So like the suction's over here, but this agitator is doing its best to push the debris over to here, and it's kind of fighting itself. So I don't know what model caused them to make the change, or on what model the change was made finally, but on most Dilematic machines, the brushes go this way. And in fact, Hoover had to introduce differently curved brush strips to fit the later Dilematic agitators. So I do always like how Hoover would let you know on every machine. The Hoover cleaner makes rugs last longer. And it's interesting that even, I don't know, is that in spite of their market dominance, or is their market dominance because of that continual reinforcement that, yes, a Hoover is what your rugs need? Also, always found it interesting that they put the model information on the bottom plate, which to me seemed like a kind of an impermanent part of the machine. That comes off like that, and then you've got these two little levers to hold the brush in. I'm not going to remove it. So the Dilematic design was around until the late 70s, and in the early 70s, I believe, Hoover introduced the Dilematic power drive, where they took this basic design, they made a transmission that would go forwards and backwards depending on which way, whether you were pushing or pulling the handle. It had a control cable that would run down on the inside. And the motor had a longer shaft so that two belts could be installed, and the one belt ran the transmission, the other belt ran the agitator. And that made a heavy vacuum even heavier, but it made it quite a joy to use. And in fact, my paternal grandfather had a power drive Dilematic that he would have bought when he built his home in the early 70s, which was a large sprawling ranch house full of carpeting. And his wife probably said, "I'm not vacuuming all that unless you get one of the new power drive Hoover cleaners." And my recollection of that machine was that up here at the handle, there was about half a roll of electrical tape going all over. This must have pulled out, and that was his fix. And the other thing I remember was my grandfather said, and he was an engineer, mind you, he said, "Yeah, that thing doesn't work too well anymore because, you know, when vacuums get old, all the dirt going through kind of wears out the impeller casings, and then they don't have as much suction." And as a youngster, I took that at face value, but since then, obviously, I've called that into serious question, this being a clean air machine. And it also makes me wonder what actually was going on with that unit. He replaced it with one of the early Hoover wind tunnels in the early 2000s. I didn't hear that signature Hoover grumble of the agitator on the carpet, and that reminded me to turn the dial back to full carpet suction. Another interesting feature of these that I believe Hoover introduced because the bag was concealed, so you were kind of apt to forget all about it until it was way too full. So Hoover had an airflow powered check bag indicator. It's got a light spring on it so that when the vacuum is off, it's showing check bag, which might be just an accidental little, okay, that's just how it's going to be. Or it might have been a conscious decision to say, okay, every time you have your vacuum, you take it out of the closet and unwrap the cord. This little thing, plus the fact that your cord release is also your bag door release, might remind you to check the bag before or after each use. And the earlier Hoover uprights with cloth shakeout bags actually said empty after every use right on the bag. So anyway, there it is, my Hoover Dial-A-Matic 1110, which incidentally, I always thought these sounded rather unpleasant and just noisy and not pleasing compared to the convertibles with their low purr. This sounds about as good as I've ever heard a Dilematic sound, but it is still quite loud, partly due to the high RPM of the motor and partly because the sound damping foam that would have been in here has long since come apart. So maybe I'll experiment with putting some material inside here, not to restrict the airflow, but just to make this thing a little bit quieter to the ear. So anyway, thanks for watching.